Independent Electoral Commission says over 1 million people turned up to register to vote for the upcoming municipal elections. A quarter of those were new additions to the voters' roll. On the second day of the registration, 9 voting stations were unable to open due to service delivery protests. So to talk to us about the hesitancy to register and the glitches in the process is Independent Elections Analyst Dawie Scholtz. Dawie, thank you so much for your time this evening. I mean, we were looking and taking into account what happened for Saturday, Sunday, as well as the online registrations today. How would you rank, just in terms of, the turnout of the voter registration weekend and also just the processes that were put in place to allow people to register to vote?
Well, let's take it sequentially. So let's start with just the quantitative outcome over the weekend. I think we are now quite certain that this is probably the lowest outcome and the lowest turnout for a voter registration weekend in any South African election for the last 10 years or so that I've witnessed. So I think we heard that 1.7 million people engaged with the IEC either through the online portal or at sites. But of course, these 1.7 million engagements were mostly for people who are updating their registration or checking their registration, so in other words, people who are already registered to vote. Of that 1.7 million, only about 430,000 or so were actually new registrations, so people who were not previously registered, so typically more young people. That's a very, very low number. That number is usually closer to 1 million, and so coming in at 430 is very low. So I think that's the one signal that it's quite low. And of course, the other concern is that since 2019, our voters' roll has shrunk by 1.1 million people due to natural causes, due to the typical attrition that takes place. But usually these voting or these weekends allow for new registrations to overtake the attrition, right? Which has not been the case now. There's way fewer people being registered than were shed off of the voters' roll, which means that for the first time in a long time, we are going into an election with a smaller voters' roll than we had previously. So I think two signs that this is not a big number and not an impressive turnout performance. So that's it sort of quantitatively. Look, in terms of the processes over the weekend, I think one can't be too harsh on the IEC, right? Like I have quite a lot of sympathy for the context within which they're conducting these operations. It's obviously the context of COVID. They've had to do this at relatively short notice. It's also not entirely on them, right? I think many of the parties didn't run a full-on registration campaign and didn't have posters up long in advance, didn't have effective mobilization campaigns as per previous elections. Having said all of that, it is pretty clear that the IEC system wasn't entirely smooth this weekend, right? So I, for example, tried to change my registration details over the weekend, and it had to be done manually. The system didn't work. And I think that was the case for many people, which obviously slows things down and creates an error rate. And then I know throughout the day today, there's been heavy traffic on the online portal, with many people reporting frustration and struggling to actually register online. So clearly there are some systems glitches. I think it's tough, and the IEC has to improve on these processes, but then again, we also has to have a little bit of sympathy for the IEC given the difficult context they're working in.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned different points, and we'll unpack some of the points that you've touched on. But when it comes to the low registration turnout, as you said, it's the first time in about 10 years or so that we're seeing this low amount of voter registrations. Does that speak significantly to voter apathy? I mean, are we sitting with a country where potential voters are just simply despondent at this point and have got no faith in political parties, any politician at this point?
Look, I think there's a couple of data points we have that support that thesis, right? So firstly, we don't know that for a fact yet because we need to study this in detail. But I think, as I said, there's a couple of points that support that point. So first and foremost is just if you look at the turnout patterns in elections in the last kind of 10 years or so, turnout is systematically going down in election by election. So in the 2014 national government election, about 73% of people turned out to vote. In the 2019 national government election, the last one, the number was only 65. So it came down a lot. And there was a similar shift between the last 2 local government elections, right? So I think it suggests that there's a trend of lower participation. I think the one thing one could say that's perhaps points that it's not such a huge disaster is that for most mature democracies, our turnout is still relatively high, and maybe we're just actually, maturing as a democracy, and our turnout rates are becoming like other democracies around the world, right? But the interesting other thing that I'll say about your point about despondency and this interest in the political process is that if you look at the polling in South Africa now on how warmly people feel about the different political parties, we are now at an unprecedented high for the number of people who don't like any of our political parties. So they're frustrated with all the parties, or many people are frustrated with all the parties. And I can believe that's driving some people either not to turn out to vote, and maybe some young people not to register to vote, right? Which is a potential problem for a democracy. Democratic participation obviously is a good thing. And of course, it also points to just strategic problems for the various parties. I think they also have to ask difficult questions about why they can't get a certain segment of South African voters excited and supporting them.
Yeah. Could the IEC, in your opinion, have done more to prevent the non-opening of the 9 voting stations? And also the report that came out during the weekend of how outside of Pietermaritzburg, we saw that the EFF was prohibited from campaigning. Julius Malema, in fact, the leader, was prohibited from campaigning, because of the ANC blocking the way. And then there was this argument that the IEC will be working closely with the South African Police Service so that they do not find themselves in these situations where you have politicians blocking each other, so as it were, to campaign, and also voting sites being closed because of service delivery protests. Could more have been done to avert this?
Look, I think we have a history in South Africa of communities protesting around elections, right? And this has systematically happened in many elections previously, where in small pockets, either registration days are disrupted or voting days are disrupted because a particular community decides that they would rather, as a group, protest and not participate, right? I think that has always been on small scale happening in South Africa, and has been accepted as a kind of acceptable form of, of protest. So I think 9 voting stations out of 23,151 is not a huge amount. So look, I don't think one could ding the IEC on that. I do think what is interesting is what happened between the ANC and the EFF over the weekend, right? I think it's absolutely incumbent upon all of the political leaders on all sides of the divides to actually speak out against this sort of stuff, and get their activists and local leadership on the ground to actually behave in a tolerant way, right? I think what the president said today was heartening. I think he condemned it in strong terms and suggested that ANC activists shouldn't be engaging in those sorts of activities. But I think it's really important for the political leaders to follow through on that. We have, particularly in KZN, had a history of no-go areas for certain political parties. And I think it's high time that political parties and political leaders speak out against that. So I was glad to see the president speaking out against that, but we need much more of that.
Dawie Scholtz, we'll leave it there for this evening. Thank you so much for your time. Well, we're going to be